if I can train, hundreds of students in energy justice to go out and work in utilities, work in government, work in communities to really make energy justice real, I think I can sleep well at night.
I'm Carolyn Parrs, clean tech communicator, coach, and host of Just Power, a podcast about creating a just transition to a clean energy future that leaves no one behind. If affordable, reliable, clean energy that benefits everyone is important to you, you're in the right place, my friend. We have the power to make that happen, and that's what's happening each week on the Just Power podcast. I am thrilled to have on our show today Dr. Tony Reames, who was a presidential appointee in the Biden-Harris administration in the Department of Energy as Deputy Director for Energy Justice. He established the first ever Office of Energy Justice Policy and Analysis. Today, he is the Tishman Professor of Environmental Justice, an Associate Professor at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability, and the Director of the Detroit Sustainability Clinic. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you so much for having me, Carolyn.
I'm so excited to have you on, especially at this time. I feel like I have a superstar on. I hope everyone listening knows a little know more about Tony before we end. It's done so much in energy equity for so many years. So Tony, that's where I'm going to begin. Your research has really dove into energy justice, energy equity. And just so we're all on the same page, I want to ask, what is energy equity to you?
That is such a great question, right? And I think it really goes back to kind of how I got into this work, trying to define what this concept is, and not that it's a concept that I created, but it's a concept that I luckily found to actually address the interest that I had in the energy space. And so when I think about defining energy justice, I really look at how do we understand the participation of communities that have been left out of energy decision making? But then how do we also use our energy decision making to eradicate and address the harm that communities have experienced by the current energy system? And so as we're in this moment of energy transition, it's really both making sure that people are able to participate, but it's also making sure that the new energy system doesn't perpetuate the harms of the current energy system. And achieving that is true energy justice.
Yes. No small task. That is, but an incredibly important one, because whatever our systems that we've had for many, many years, we're moving into an energy transition, or we are in the energy transition. And even though we want to speed it up, everyone wants to get to decarbing tomorrow. The equity piece has to be integrated, or else we're just repeating the same thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I started this work during what could be considered our previous energy transition for this current one that we're in. And it was coming out of the economic recession of the 2008-2009 era. When Congress and President Obama put millions of dollars in what we thought now was astronomical amount of resources into clean energy to help us get out of the recession. I'm thinking about it having this kind of triple bottom line effect, impacting the environment, improving economics, but then also thinking about the social side of energy. And so I often credit elders in Kansas City, Missouri, where I was doing my dissertation research at the time, with sitting me down and talking about their energy affordability challenges, talking about their fear of participating in government programs to increase their energy efficiency, because they had seen previous iterations of government programs where people lost their homes because of nefarious activities like second mortgages to put in new windows or put in insulation. And so it was this culmination of, concern about energy costs, recognizing that their homes were inefficient, but then this fear and unwillingness to want to participate in current programs. And so that really got me thinking about the intersections of energy, which is something we view as very technical, but it has all these social elements to what
Yes.
makes it successful.
Yes. I'm so glad you have dove into it the way you did, right? And a scholar, right, in this subject. Um, let's talk about, you talked about the communities, right, that are disproportionately affected
Mhm.
by energy. And so, like, I'm a clean energy advocate, but with this transition we're having, it's not cheap to do what
Right,
we're doing. We're changing everything.
right.
So let's just talk about those communities. I want to know, how do you define the communities who are disproportionately affected, whether it's energy policy or legacy issues? And what are the impacts that they are suffering from?
Yeah, that is a tough one, right? It's really difficult to begin to parse out the characteristics of communities that at the federal level we call disadvantage, for the purpose of Justice 40, which I know we'll talk about today. But I think at the brass level, just kind of base level understanding, we're talking about communities that have high energy burdens, spend a large proportion of their income on energy costs. And so those are
Yes.
communities that are spending more than 6% of their income on energy. That's considered unaffordable. But we know in communities, a lot of African American communities or low income communities, households are spending 10, 20, 30. We found people spending more than 50% of their income on energy costs, either
Oh my
because
goodness.
their homes are totally inefficient, their systems are inefficient,
Right.
or the energy rates are just too high in the places that they live, and they're either in cold weather states or super hot states and need a lot of heating or cooling. One of the other disadvantages that communities face is hosting dirty energy sites, right? People being looking out of their window at smokestacks from coal plants. And then a lot of times those same communities can see the energy being generated, but are less likely to be able to afford it. And so you have this kind of benefit burden imbalance between communities. They see energy being made and going to power other communities that can afford
Right.
it, and they're choosing between heating their homes or buying food. And so those are some of the challenges and disparities that we see, or inequities that we see, when it comes to energy and community.
Yeah. I just visualized that I've seen it and
Right.
visualize it, and it's just see it happening in front of you, all that energy, right, and the production, and meanwhile you're having trouble, the huge burden of even
Mm-hmm.
paying for energy.
Yeah.
So I want to get into Justice 40 and where we are and what that is. But before I do, this is like hot off the press,
Mm.
which I read on my LinkedIn page. So it's back to the conversation between the delicate balance between an ambitious climate goals and the need for fair transition. And the Scottish Parliament apparently is wrestling with this right now. And I have to go yay to Scotland, because they've done a lot. Many of their utilities have just been so far ahead of where we are here in the U.S. Come on, USA! But the cabinet secretary for net, I'm reading this, the cabinet secretary for net zero and energy, her name is Gillian Martin, said this, and I'll quote her. The scale of societal changes needed for 75% reduction in emissions by 2030 would not be fair or just on people in our society. It would cause serious impacts across communities and hit our people exceptionally hard, and therefore we cannot achieve them.
Mm.
Which is like,
Mm.
right now. And meanwhile, out in LA, that LA 100, what they've done in LA, that LA municipality is like the largest municipality in the country, and they have created 100, or are creating 100% renewable energy, and inviting the many groups and many people who are right in the throes of the front lines to
Right.
participate in that. I want to know what you think.
Yeah, that is
I know I kind of threw
no,
you a
yeah,
hook
that's a
here.
good one,
It's like,
right?
you didn't tell me
Yeah,
about that, Carolyn.
yeah.
So,
No, Carolyn, we have to there's this fine balance between our climate goals within a system that's already unjust, right?
Yes.
Within a space that uh, was never created for everybody to participate in equitably, right? As long as energy is a commodity, then there will
Mm.
be producers and consumers who are not playing on the same level. You mentioned LA 100. There's also Puerto Rico 100, PR 100 that took a similar approach to LA 100 by the folks at the Department of Energy to really think about if the goal is 100% clean energy, who needs to be at the table to determine what that looks like, right? And I think that is phenomenal. That is unprecedented. That is unique,
Hmm.
because that is not how our energy system has been set up, which is what makes it so difficult to move in a different direction. And is probably um, why we're reading and hearing what we're hearing from Scotland, right? Um,
Yes.
because you begin to have to think about all the different partners and elements of the system. So it's the from cradle to grave, a lot of people like to talk about, right? And so
Yeah.
it's who's using it, it's who's producing it, it's where the materials are coming from. And every time you tinker with one piece of that, another part starts to unravel. And we're not in a place where we can just scrap it and start from scratch, right? And
Yes.
so that is what makes it so difficult to think about a future where the energy system is equitable and just, but also addresses our climate goals. And that was some of the stuff we tried and continue to wrestle with when I was in the federal government, some of the research I did when I was critical of the federal government on the outside, and now being back
That's
on
why
the
they
outside.
hired you, right?
Fingers crossed they were like, okay, we didn't read his papers, maybe. But yeah, on the outside again, thinking about knowing what we were able to work on, what we were able to accomplish, what communities now are thinking about this clean energy transition and how it either will impact them or benefit them. And so, what is the role of me as a researcher, the role of a university to really play a big component in bringing these two worlds together, the community and the energy industry?
So, yes, no, we can do this?
Okay, so I do believe we can, right? I'm an optimist on most days, but I do believe that the challenges and the moment are so critical, right? Here in
Yeah.
the U.S., we're seeing both sides of our country are on fire, literally, right? I don't think I've ever seen that where we have wildfires on the West Coast and the East Coast at the same time. And so I think there's an urgency
Yeah.
in this moment. And I think there's a recognition and a reckoning with justice, particularly here in the US and across the globe, I think, that are requiring us to think differently about the path forward. And so, looking at some of the conversations that are happening at COP right now, you know, people are still wrestling with that, right? And I think as
Yeah.
long as we're wrestling with that and having a conversation,
It's
that
good,
there's a
right?
possibility, right?
It's very good. So speaking about wrestling with it,
Mm,
let's just transition to Justice 40,
yeah.
right? And just so I'll just say what it is in case you might not be up on that. It came out of the Inflation Reduction Act. And Justice 40 is a federal program that earmarks 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments to flow directly into disadvantaged communities. Okay. So, Tony, how should we be looking at this now?
Yeah. So I'll take us back just a little further, Carolyn. Justice 40 was a campaign promise. President Biden
Mm.
ran on, um, restarting the U.S. economy coming out of the pandemic, but also doing that in an equitable and just way. And so, sometimes it was called Environmental Justice 40 because it's this
Oh,
recognition
okay.
that environmental justice communities were hit really hard by the pandemic because of underlying health conditions from poor environmental quality in EJ communities, we call them. But it's also his own personal recognition of growing up in Western Pennsylvania, near coal plants, steel plants, and having asthma as a child. So the president recognized environmental
Mm.
justice, had a lot of environmental justice advocates as part of the campaign, pushing him to do more on environmental justice. And so there were also, a couple state efforts. So New York had just passed its climate policy. California had its, disadvantaged communities climate policy. And so we had some state level examples. And so it was like, how could we scale this and do this at the federal level? Really difficult to say 40% of dollars.
Yeah,
And so that is why
benefits.
this idea of 40% benefits, which
Right.
benefits could be dollars depending on the program, but primarily it was trying to think of ways to have additional benefits flow to communities, the disadvantaged communities that we talked about earlier, through investments in our climate, clean energy, transportation, to really put communities that were feeling the burden of the pandemic, the burden of climate change worst, putting them at the front of the line to benefit from resources that would be flowing out of the federal government. No, 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 no. It's not an easy task
I
because
bet.
one, it's never enough money, right? Even the trillions of dollars that was invested by Congress, when you're talking about this from an equity perspective, we're talking about putting resources into communities that have been underfunded for decades. And
Right.
so, as long as money has to spread across this entire huge country, it's like a layer of peanut butter, when you're making a
Uh,
sandwich, right? You're not plopping a piece down, you're actually spreading it out. And so then when you start
mm.
slicing it up by percentages, that makes it super difficult. And I think that resulted in, some people not being able to see the benefits in their lives over the last 4 years because they're small, they're incremental, but the problems are much larger. And so that's one of the challenges of doing an effort like this.
Yeah. It's massive, frankly, and it apparently we're 2 years into a 10-year program.
That's
Uh
another great point, right? Okay, that's so. So just to give people a little inside baseball, right? Creating a brand new initiative like Justice 40, one was about transforming the way federal programs are designed, right? And so, programs, a lot of grant programs are designed to, look for certain criteria when people apply, without any concern or consideration for communities that never get grants or are underfunded and have these issues. And so, one example I like to often use how we shifted thinking was looking at grid modernization programs that were funded by the infrastructure law. So typically, programs have a formula for funding, and it goes to states or communities based on population,
okay.
and a few other characteristics. We shifted some of those programs to think about some of these other disadvantages that we were talking about, like high energy burden.
Yeah.
So communities that are suffering from energy burden, which that typically would not have been a part of the formula. And so now you're accounting for
Mm.
things like, unaffordability or communities that have more outages, because their grid, is not up to snuff. And so it
Yeah.
really was a shift in just how we thought about communities that need resources. And so a formula might give you more resources if you're disadvantaged because the resources are actually trying to address that disadvantage, right? And so it's not just a community gets more money because it's a large community, but it's
Mm.
because that community actually needs its grid upgraded. And so again, it was a shift in thinking to make sure that communities that were underfunded actually got the resources that they needed.
Got it. There's I just want to let everyone know that I got my hands on a paper at that was done by Columbia. You might know this, Tony. Columbia School, Law School, and it's called "Implementing the Inflation Reduction Act: Progress to Date and Risks from a Changing Administration.
Yeah.
It's worth the read. I'll have it in my show notes for you. And this was actually written right before we had our election. So, not, I don't know if you want to just comment on that a little bit about, because that's one of the burning questions that I'm hearing over and over again. We really don't know
Yeah.
at this point, but maybe you know more than we know. So
Yeah.
what's your take on that?
Yeah. A changing administration. I think that is, keeping a lot of people up at night, right? Because, like you mentioned, this was not a quick fix, something like Justice 40
Right.
or the Infrastructure Law or the Inflation Reduction Act, which is not sexy in trying to explain that to people, right? People want problems fixed immediately, and rightfully so. But when we think about something like the New Deal, that wasn't done overnight,
Yeah.
right? But we all look at it from a historical perspective. And so I'm assuming at
Great.
some point in the future,
Yeah.
people will look at this moment differently, from all the roads and bridges and pipes and ports and things that were repaired or built during this time. Kind of sticking with Justice 40, that is an executive order. So it was created by the executive, by President Biden, for how he wanted to manage and run his executive branch. With a new executive, that means that executive orders could either, kind of fall by the wayside or kind of continue to operate in the background, or a new executive could say, I want to roll back all the executive orders of my predecessor.
Mm.
And so that is the fear and concern that some people
Yeah.
have, whether an initiative like Justice 40 may go away. Justice 40 was created in Executive Order 14008, which is the climate change order. It was called Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. So there were a lot of other things in that executive order,
Okay.
like energy communities, so focusing on communities that would be impacted by the transition, whether it's the closure of mines, the closure of coal plants. There were also other ways that the country was tackling climate change in that executive order. And so if there is an attempt to undo all executive orders that focus on climate change, Justice 40 plus a host of other initiatives could go away. It's unclear now
Yes.
if people read Project 2025, and if that is actually implemented, then it is clear that those types of programs would be paused for some period of time.
Yes. And that's what I guess the fear is, but also
Right.
the opportunity, right? Because
Great.
what
Yes.
I'm seeing, especially, I did a Yale program,
Mhm.
um, energy justice conference they had recently, few days after the election. And the young people they are so fired up,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I don't think this is going away. And
Right.
as a matter of fact, and I want to kind of segue a little bit into utilities, because you've done a lot of work with utilities and helping them integrate, right, this
Yeah.
whole equity piece into their business model, right? And that's such an important piece. I've also worked with the utilities. So I want to talk a little bit about that.
Mm.
And that I'm just speculating, but it's not going to go away. And even if it does, an administration comes and goes, right?
Mhm.
Either side, these kind of momentums and our energy transition will continue, right? Because we have to do it no
Right.
matter what. I mean, our grid is old, right? And that's why the modernization is happening. So, and I think, and this equity piece is so key for that. So that being said, utilities, right? Many of us, pay that utility bill every month, right? And we're not sure sometimes what's happening behind the bill, but we pay it. And but those folks that have worked with utilities, I want to just talk about they've had low income programs for many years, right? What's different here? What's different in the equity piece? versus another program, or even a multitude of programs that are low income?
Yeah. So, yeah, you hit on a couple things there because I do want to reiterate what you mentioned that this will not go away. Like I said, there may be pauses in the level of support at the federal level, but I think states, local governments, and utilities are already playing in this space and have been and will continue. So that is a really great
Yay.
point. Yeah, and I think the low income programs is a great example of that, right? We've been doing this since the 70s or 80s.
Mhm.
A lot of the low income assistance programs came out of the oil crisis in the 70s, and they still exist, and they're increasing,
Right.
and they're being more effective and more efficient in the delivery of those programs. And so, while the arc of the moral universe is long, it does bend toward justice with more efforts and more pushes to do that. What's different now, Carolyn, is that aside from just income qualification, people are applying these programs from a spatial justice perspective. So, thinking about communities or place based approaches
Mhm.
to this, because we still do live in a very kind of residentially segregated society, whether it's by income or by race. And so people are understanding too that there's some peer networking included in this. And so if low income household A lives next door to low income household B, by focusing on A and B and then maybe C, D, E on down the road, that you reduce your mobilization costs to go into that neighborhood. You kind of have some cross learning between households, and from a planning perspective, that allows utilities to do better planning for the rollout of their programs, and kind of take stress on their grid off at a geographic perspective
Okay.
than popping all across their utility territory and touching a house on the east side and a house on the west side. And so I do think this idea of spatial justice has entered into the decisioning and the implementation of programs in a way that we didn't do before. Another
Mm.
thing is being a little more in depth about the type of programs that are offered to low income households. So it's not just bill assistance, it's actually the energy efficiency of that home. Some utility companies are getting more into the kind of social work side of it and creating budgeting assistance for households, right? And so how do you
Really?
get
I
somebody
haven't heard that.
how do you get somebody out of needing assistance over and over again when it's a larger budget issues? And so the utility company here in the Detroit area, I don't know if they still do this, but they used to. They had a buddy program, that's what it was called. And so, if someone got onto the bill assistance program, they had a buddy that helped them through the rest of their kind of economic challenges, as well as helping them identify other services in the community that could benefit them. And so it's a new territory for utilities.
Mm.
A lot of times
This
it might be
whole
a yeah,
social part,
social, yeah,
community
but
engagement,
yeah,
you
but
know?
there's a good book about utilities of the future.
Uh-huh.
Um, Fox Penner is his last name, and it's really about what are the other services that utility companies provide or will provide in the future, to be more integral to people's household, right? So it's not just your kilowatt hours, or your BTUs. It's a little more like what is the role that this company plays in your life. And I think some public service commissions are pushing utilities to do that. Some of them have really innovative leaders who are saying we're going to be more than just an energy, provider. We're going to be an energy services company, and I
It's
think that's going to
a
be
business opportunity,
that's going to
frankly, if
take it
they
to a whole new
right?
level, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any stories out there of other of like wins of communities and utilities working together on that level?
Yeah. So I'll give one example. It's not necessarily utility and companies working together, but it's utilities recognizing research out there and making changes to benefit their communities.
Okay.
And so we did a study, some students and I, here in Detroit, looking at access and affordability of LED bulbs. And so
Mhm.
what we found was that in communities, particularly low income communities, LED bulbs were about half as available in stores. And if they were available, they were like double the price that they were
Wow.
in wealthier, more suburban neighborhoods.
Interesting.
And primarily that was because utilities often partner with big box stores like Lowe's and Home Depot to provide rebates on bulbs. And then the stores that are located in poor neighborhoods, often like smaller stores or
Yeah.
hardware stores, they either decide to carry LED bulbs, but they don't have the partnership with the utility company.
Got it.
And so Ameren in Illinois saw that study, and they are more rural, but have some of the same kind of economic development challenges that urban poor communities have. You don't get the big box stores, you don't get Lowe's and Home Depot.
All right.
And so they recognized that they weren't partnering with local hardware stores and dollar stores. And so they created a program to offer rebates in those stores to bring down the cost of LED for an underserved community. And so, again, this idea
Yeah.
that there are things that aren't traditionally thought of. It's easy to contact Lowe's corporate and say, all your Lowe's stores in my territory, I want to knock the cost down. It's more difficult to go to individual stores and say, hey, let me help you with a rebate program. But that's what we need, right? Because that's the reality of how people access new technologies. They go to their local stores, and if it's not available or if it's too costly, they won't adopt.
That's right. That's right. Okay. So like the mom and pops, right? And maybe even if somewhere rural that's further
Mm-hmm.
out that
Mm-hmm.
don't get the advantages of
Yeah.
being next to a big box store.
Yeah, I grew up in South Carolina. Maybe the Piggly Wiggly. You might want to knock off,
Piggly
a
Wiggly.
dollar or
I know
two,
that
right?
store.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is like a lot of different things that utilities can do. Let me
Hmm.
ask you, what would you say? So many of I've done some research and even some calls to sustainability directors at utilities and maybe some customer service, and many of them know about energy equity. It's on their plate on some level, but they just don't know how to begin with because it's such a big idea. So what could you say for, let's just say they're interested, not like talking them into you should be doing that, but they know they should be. How can you give some ideas on maybe some best practices or some ways to begin this process?
Yeah. Thinking about from easiest to hardest, huh? Maybe.
First,
So
understand what energy equity is. It would be a
yeah. So
beginning.
first, first is that recognition, right?
Right.
Recognizing that within your utility territory that there are
Hmm.
vulnerabilities that certain communities have that others don't, right? And so that's everything from affordability to proximity to energy infrastructure, right? Or lack of access or, you know, overexposure, right? And so you kind of need to kind of classify people across some continuum to understand what makes them more or less vulnerable when it comes to energy equity issues.
Okay.
So there's some principles of energy justice like availability, affordability. One is due process, and so participation. I know a lot of times people are apprehensive about community engagement, but I do think there are opportunities for advisory councils or for
Yes.
workshops and listening sessions where you bring people in to kind of understand what the concerns are and do it outside of the traditional kind of rate case that you're taking to your public service commission, so you can bring the heat down a little bit, right? And so it's some of these informal engagement opportunities, I think, that we get so stuck in the kind of rigor of our required public participation processes
Mm,
that we don't, do it outside of that. And so if you're meeting the community for the first time because you're about to ask for an increase in energy rates, then
Not a good timing.
it's not a good time. It's going to be tense. And so,
Okay.
and there are some good examples of some, kind of innovation hubs and things across the country in different utilities. And so, one of the things I've been thinking about too is how do we bring those folks together so we can begin to share and learn the best practices
Nice.
across.
What is an innovation hub?
So, and that may not be what all utilities call them. I know a few do, but it's where people within the organization are coming, like that question you asked, right? About how do we do energy equity? And so
Mm,
they'll select folks from across the utility to come together, and they may work together as a team for some time to develop a project to come up with a pilot they might propose in
got
their
it.
next rate case, or something they might try out, or they learn about some data that the utility collects and they analyze it in a different way so they can design a pilot program. And so it's really, you know, folks within the utility that are trying to accomplish some of these goals that we're talking about here today. It could be other goals too, but I mostly talk to folks that are doing energy justice related work. But they just put their minds together to think about innovative ways within their constraints to address this issue.
Got it. Got it. I love that. So, like you're just saying, putting together groups, maybe different
Mm,
departments, right?
yeah,
Getting out of your silos because it is systems wide what we're
yeah,
talking
it
about,
is.
and then just having discussions,
Yep.
maybe even bringing some of your community members up into that
Hmm.
discussion, right?
Hmm.
At
Yeah,
certain times, and developing a pilot.
yeah,
And the
yeah. Bringing
commissions
in
would
academic
like that,
partners,
wouldn't they,
and
those commissions?
that would be, yeah, they would, and
Right?
there are other groups that would, that fund those type of projects too. When I was at Department of Energy, we the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office launched something called C2C, Communities to Clean Energy.
Mm.
And it was this idea of being able to bring communities, utilities, and either state, local government together to think about clean energy plans. We also did another one called Communities Leap, Communities Local Energy Action Program. And that was very similar. We brought together community and business and government to put together clean energy plans so they could then go after resources to actually implement. And so it was this idea that we knew it wasn't enough just to have resources available for communities or resources available for utilities or resources available for governments. We needed some way for these entities to begin to talk to each other. And then we wrote that into a lot of the infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act funding because they had
Uh-huh.
already done the planning. And so now that same coalition could go after funding in those larger bills.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, I love that. How would a utility say they do this and they create a pilot? How do you measure impact on
Mm-hmm.
right success and impact on this?
Yeah. Yeah, that's when you contract with academic researcher. No.
By the name of Tony Reames, and he can help
Right.
you with your data problem.
No, I think that is key, right? And probably one of my frustrations in my work over the last several years is that we've gotten really good at identifying the problem. We've gotten really good at being able to show disparities, show inequities,
Right.
map it, visualize it. But when a program or a policy is developed or implemented, we don't necessarily have the same rigor to evaluate its success. And so that is something that, I am focused on. But we do have examples where people do focus groups and workshops and interviews and collect data. But again, those things take time, right? And so I think coming out of the last few years of investment, we'll start to see, are people reducing their energy costs with more air quality monitors coming online? Are we reducing
Uh-huh.
air pollution in communities where we're reducing coal plant coal-powered fire plants, or retrofitting homes. And so I do think a lot of the programs now are including that evaluation component. One project we did in Detroit, we called it reducing energy insecurity, but we had energy case managers to help households kind of wade through all the different programs that exist, and they all have
Oh,
different applications. And so they did home visits, and we did monitoring of their energy consumption, reviewing their energy bills. And some of the early data that we're getting back is, people are saying, oh, well, I did this. I made this improvement to my home. I applied for this program. I was able to buy a new TV because, now my energy bill went down, or I learned how to set my thermostat and now my home is warmer or cool, and so some of it is the financial savings, the energy savings, but some of it is all this other, kind of co-benefits of addressing energy. I often say energy is not a panacea, but it is a heck of a mediator for a lot of other things, right? Because it becomes the second highest cost that we all have outside of our rent and mortgage. And if your home is paid off, then it's the highest cost
yes.
that you have. And so if you can address that through, some means, then people have abilities to do a lot of other things.
Yes. And that's back to where the impact is really talking to the communities that you're
Yes.
working with, right? And finding out what does that mean to them, right? This is like pre and post, right? And
Mm-hmm.
seeing, and then what does success look like
Right.
for them,
For
right?
them.
And
Yeah.
understanding that.
Yeah.
Um, this is a really new territory, right? For many utilities, and yet it could be a profitable one, right? It requires utilities are like there's a lot of engineers in utilities, right? So we're getting into the social side, but
Mm-hmm.
there's opportunities there as well, I think, to better serve your customers on all levels of what they really need. So yeah,
Yeah.
I just wanted to point that out because I think building the case for equity, there is a business case for equity
There is. Yeah.
for
Yeah.
I know that our friends at eSource, which is the first time I heard you speak, they do have a group of companies, a small group of companies that have focused on this, right, and are working together. So I would think that would be a win, right? Because if
Yeah.
you can
That would
prove
be.
it there, you can roll it out elsewhere. So
Yeah.
yay, eSource for doing that kind of work. Let's do a little shift as we begin to wrap up. I mean, you're in after your DOE appointment, you returned to the University of Michigan and you accepted a role of this relatively new sustainability clinic in Detroit, right? Tell
Right.
us a
Right.
little bit. What is it and why was it created and what are you doing there?
Yeah. I talked about a few of the technical assistance programs that we created while I was at Department of Energy. And these were, again, programs where we were trying to prepare communities and communities broadly, right? Not just the people in the communities, but also the companies and the government of those communities for the federal resources coming down, as well as what was available at their state and local level. So when I decided to come back to the university, it was this recognition that we were in implementation phase. So we were moving out of kind of Congress appropriating dollars, us designing programs, and then putting
Mhm.
applications out. And so I've always thought about how do investments show up in people's communities, right? Thinking about that impact or what do people see. And then communities that have been under resourced are also unprepared to apply for millions of dollars, right? And so the university has an opportunity. We are a public university. We have a responsibility to support communities of Michigan. And one of those
Okay.
primary communities is Detroit, right? The largest city in Michigan, a majority African American city, the heart of the auto industry,
Right.
the creator of Motown music. It has this
And
cachet,
I
this
hear a very
grit.
big green movement happening in Detroit too,
Yes,
right?
yeah. So this excitement around, urban agriculture and renewable energy, circular economy. It was just a lot happening here. And in an environment and sustainability school, we often have a lot of community centered projects where community members are clients and students work with them. But we really wanted to solidify our connection to Detroit. I had made a lot of new connections, even beyond my connections that I first made here when I was at
Okay.
the Department of Energy, getting to know communities that wanted to be at the forefront of the energy transition. And so this is an
Right.
opportunity for me to support those communities even further, kind of coalesce our projects around environment, sustainability, and climate change. And then also be a convener for those communities as they're working on their individual projects so they can learn from each other. And so a big part of the clinic is building an umbrella of a learning community for students, faculty, and community groups.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's a really,
How
you know,
exciting. You
it's a
could
really
put
great
together a case
opportunity
study and go back to those utilities and say, "See?"
to say, look, you
You
can
know?
join in here. Yeah.
Right? And
And
not
it is
just
kind of,
in Detroit, but this could
yeah.
be easily a national programs, right?
So that's another part of it, Carolyn, is really like, so we're launching in the spring a community fellow program where a community member who's working in climate and sustainability can come to the university for several days and have meetings and meet with faculty. But then we're also supporting them to go somewhere else in the country or state to learn from another community that's doing something similar. And so, because I recognize that, again, so many people are working hard in this space, but they're doing it isolated because they don't know that somebody else is
Ah,
working on this. And so I think the only way we're going to continue in this work and get out of, this kind of small individual scale of this is if people know and learn from each other across the country. And so if we can support that, um, and again, building this container for people to learn and share, then I think we'll see more people doing, and more people will know what other people are doing, and
yes,
then it just really grows. And so I feel like that's a small role I can play, kind of in
small,
the
right?
space that I'm in. Right? Yeah.
What is some of the can you say any of the key projects that are happening in that clinic?
Yeah. Yeah. So a couple, we have a couple projects with the city of Detroit. So one that's super exciting is the Detroit Neighborhood Solar Project. And so Detroit has a huge vacancy challenge, vacant lots. Some communities are 20, 30, 40% vacant. And
Right.
so the city has a 2030, 2050 clean energy goal. And so one thing they've decided to do is invite communities to apply to be part of this solar neighborhood project. And so the city would consolidate vacant lots and build solar farms. And the homes
Hmm.
around the solar farm get a set of community benefits, whether it's energy efficiency, whether it's direct dollars to support their household. And so we have students working with the sustainability office here in those
Got it.
communities to understand what benefits they'd like to receive from being a host of that community solar farm. And so that's going to be amazing. But it also
Yeah.
highlights some of the challenges because Michigan doesn't have a community solar program where communities can create community solar. And so it took some education to, let households know that, well, the energy generated here will actually offset municipal energy in your municipal buildings. And so you're providing a benefit to the city, but then you have these other benefits that will come to you. And it's not necessarily the energy, but by participating, you can reduce your energy consumption and energy costs. And so there's a lot of education
Yes.
around energy that's needed too. Some of the other projects are looking at biofuels
Hmm.
through creating a neighborhood level composting program. And so, can you create enough compost to create enough biofuels that could create, or generate wealth for a community? So, kind of like a biofuels co-op.
Okay.
So yeah, so just some really like
Right. I love the
creative
idea of
and
generating wealth on
yes,
topic, right?
yeah,
Because if you're
yeah,
saving energy, you're creating energy,
hmm hmm
that's
yeah,
part there's a perhaps a partnership there.
Yeah,
Cities,
yeah, exactly.
universities, maybe even the utilities, right?
Yeah, that's what we've been looking at. Like, are there resources in communities, right? Particularly communities that we view as under resourced or undervalued. Um, so showing them that they have value, and then finding these
Mm,
partnerships so they can create new economies or economic progress in their own communities. So for me, that's exciting, right? Because that's what the transition is really about. This is an unprecedented, opportunity for communities to be a part of it in a way that they haven't in the past.
right. Fabulous. You're like not waiting for other people. You're just going to make,
You got
or
to do it
companies, or
here.
you're
Do
going
it.
to
Yeah,
do
let's
it,
do it.
right? Prove it, do it, roll it out, right?
Yeah.
That's what I want to see. Tony, in closing, you have done so much in this area of justice and equity in the energy system. Um, my last question is, if you could make your mark, which you already have, but just say like what to be known for, right, in energy equity, leaving that kind of lasting legacy, what would that be? It might be where you're at right now, it might be something. What would it be?
Yeah. So one of my favorite quotes is from George Washington Carver, who I like to say is my American hero. He was a professor at Tuskegee University, and oftentimes I kind of model myself off of his kind of teaching philosophy. And the quote is, "If you can do the common things of life in an uncommon way, you will command the attention of the world." And so I'm an engineer that
Mm.
did a PhD in public administration. And I often think about how I take, what I know technically, which is not energy. It's primarily I did transportation and wastewater,
Oh,
water treatment.
okay.
so, but taking those analytical skills and applying it to energy and to really this kind of socio-technical interaction in the energy space. And so when I think about what I want people to say about me, it's really how I was able to impact energy policy
Mm.
in a way that included people, because we can solve our energy challenges
Yes.
purely from a technical perspective, right? We, like you say, we got the know-how, but what's hindering us is the fact that this has to interact with people. And how do we educate people about energy? How do we make them a part of the decision-making process? And how people see energy as something more than just them flipping a light switch, to really understanding how integral it is to their lives. And so, if I can train, hundreds of students in
Mm.
energy justice to go out and work in utilities, work in government, work in communities to really make energy justice real, I think I can sleep well at night if that's the case.
Right on. Thank you so much. You're a superstar. How can people get in touch with you? Learn more about the cool things you're doing.
Yeah, so years ago, I started calling myself the Green Scholar. So people can go
All
to
right. Oh,
www.thegreenscholar.com, and all my contact information is there, and you can learn a little more about the projects that I've done. And yeah, I'd love to hear from folks.
all right. Thank you so much, Tony, for coming on today. You're a blessing. Uh,
Thank you,
I
Cam.
I'm so happy I got to talk to you, and
Me
I
too.
know inspiring others, young people and older folks, that can really make a difference right now and move this forward. Uh, Thank you for tuning in, my friends, to Just Power. The time is now to create equitable, accessible, clean energy for all that leaves no one behind. We're all in this together. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to Just Power wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really loved it, leave us a review and tell everyone you know about our podcast. It's going to take all of us to create a clean energy future that leaves no one behind.
The Just Power podcast is brought to you by New Mexico State University and mind over markets, helping clean energy, clean tech, and regenerative businesses craft clear and compelling messaging that scales. Want to continue this conversation with Carolyn? Follow her on LinkedIn and follow the Just Power podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and on our YouTube channel. And for more intriguing conversations, follow New Mexico State University's microlearning social pages on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube.